What happens when the most powerful country on Earth refuses to lead and the gap left behind gets filled by someone else? Right now, in the waters of the Persian Gulf, that question is no longer a theory. It is happening in real time. If you care about how power actually works in this world, you cannot afford to look away from this. Hit like right now if you want to understand the real story behind the headlines, subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is just about ships and oil. Because it is not. Let's start with the picture almost nobody is drawing correctly. For months, the news has been obsessed with one big question. Is America losing control of the Persian Gulf? Is Iran winning this war? Will there be a ceasefire? These are the questions filling every panel discussion and every opinion column. But there is a deeper question hiding underneath all of this, and almost nobody is asking it out loud. The question is not who wins a war. The question is what happens to the world when the country that used to guarantee order simply stops showing up. To understand this, we need to go back 100 years to an idea that very few people outside of economics classrooms ever hear about. It comes from a historian named Charles Kindleberger, and it explains something that most history books get wrong about the Great Depression. Most people think the Great Depression happened because the world ran out of money. Banks failed, markets crashed, and everyone assumed it was simply a financial collapse. Kindleberger looked closer and found something different. He found that the real problem was not money, it was leadership. Before the First World War, Britain held the world together. The British Navy protected the trade routes. British finance set the rules. The world economy worked because one power was willing to pay the cost of keeping it stable. After the war, Britain was broke, exhausted, and could no longer carry that weight. America was rising fast enough to take over that role, but it refused to. It wanted the benefits of being powerful without the responsibility of leading. So between an old power too tired to lead and a new power too unwilling to lead, the entire global system simply fell through the cracks. No one was steering the ship, and the ship sank. That is the Kindleberger Trap. It is not about two powers fighting each other. It is about what happens when no power is willing to hold the world together. Now hold that idea in your mind, because we are going to come back to it again and again. But first, let's deal with the idea that is dominating the headlines right now, because it is the wrong idea, and you need to understand why. A few weeks ago, the leaders of China and the United States sat down together in Beijing. During that meeting, the Chinese leader raised an old concept from ancient Greece. It is called the Thucydides Trap, named after the historian who wrote about the war between Athens and Sparta more than 2,000 years ago. The basic idea is simple. When a rising power threatens to overtake an existing power, history tends to end in war. A Harvard professor studied 16 cases where this pattern played out, and in 12 of them, war followed. The message coming from Beijing was clear. China is rising. America is dominant. History says this leads to conflict, so the world should make room for China peacefully instead of resisting it. It is a clever argument, and it makes for great headlines. But here is the detail almost nobody mentions. In the original story, the rising power lost. Athens was the one challenging the established order, and Athens was the one that was crushed. Its fleet was destroyed, its empire collapsed, its own democracy fell apart from the inside. So if you really want to use that 2,000-year-old comparison, the lesson is not that the dominant power should step aside. The lesson is that the rising challenger should be careful what it wishes for. But even that detail is not the real problem with this entire debate. The real problem is that the Thucydides Trap is asking the wrong question completely. It asks whether two giant powers will go to war with each other. That is a dramatic question, and it makes for exciting headlines, but it is not the most dangerous thing happening in the world today. The most dangerous thing is not a war between America and China. The most dangerous thing is a world where neither of them is willing to keep the lights on. And that brings us back to Kindleberger. Look at the actual behavior of both giants right now. Not what they say in speeches, but what they actually do. The United States has openly shifted its posture. The language coming out of Washington is no longer about being the world's protector. It is about putting national interest first, about no longer subsidizing the security of other nations, about treating every alliance as a transaction rather than a commitment. That is a complete shift from the role America played for nearly 80 years. And China? China is expanding its economic reach all over the world. It is building ports, railways, and trade routes. It is creating dependency through money and infrastructure. But here is what China is not doing. It is not stepping in as the guarantor of global rules. It is not enforcing freedom of navigation on the open seas. It is not providing the kind of stability that a true global leader provides. China wants the benefits of influence without the burden of responsibility, exactly like America did after the First World War. So you have one power stepping back and another power refusing to step forward. And into that empty space, something else moves in. Not a superpower, a regional power, a country that has spent decades preparing exactly for this kind of opportunity. That country is Iran. Right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important waterways on the entire planet, something extraordinary is unfolding. Around a fifth of all the oil and gas shipped by sea in the entire world passes through this narrow stretch of water. It is only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. You could almost swim across it, and reports indicate dozens of commercial ships have been crossing through it recently, not under the protection of any international naval force, not under any global maritime authority, but under permits issued directly by Iran. Iran is collecting fees. Iran is deciding which ships pass and which ships face inspection. Iran is functioning in practice as the administrator of one of the most critical choke points in the global economy. Think about what that actually means. This is not a blockade in the traditional sense. A blockade closes a passage completely. What Iran appears to be doing is different and in some ways more significant. It is not shutting the strait down. It is managing it. It is setting the terms. It is turning a global public resource into something it personally controls and profits from. One geopolitical analyst described this shift perfectly. He said the world is moving from a state of closure to a state of conditional access. There will be no return to safe, predictable routes. All anyone can do now is manage the crisis, not resolve it. That sentence deserves to sit with you for a moment. Conditional access, crisis management instead of crisis resolution. That is exactly what the Kindleberger Trap looks like when it plays out in real life. The global commons are not being destroyed outright. They are being privatized piece by whichever regional power is strong enough and bold enough to grab control. Now, before we go further, I want you to do something for me. If this is making sense so far, give this video a like, because that simple action tells more people that this kind of analysis deserves to be seen. We are just getting started, and the deeper story is even more revealing. Let's talk about how a country under decades of sanctions, with an economy far smaller than America's, has managed to put itself in this position. Because the answer is not luck. It is preparation. In the opening days of the most recent conflict, the United States and Israel carried out a strike aimed at Iran's top leadership. According to reporting, Iran's supreme leader was killed, along with members of his family. In traditional military thinking, this is supposed to be the knockout blow. You remove the head of the snake, and the body stops moving. Command structures collapse. Resistance falls apart. That is the textbook outcome. It did not happen that way. Iran had spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. Its military structure was deliberately built to survive the loss of central leadership. Instead of one command center controlling everything, Iran organized its forces into dozens of independent regional cells, each with its own weapons, its own orders, and its own ability to act without waiting for instructions from the top. It is sometimes described as a mosaic defense system. When you remove the head, the rest of the mosaic keeps moving because the pieces were never depending on a single command in the first place. Many of the operational orders were already set in motion before the strike even happened. It functioned almost like a dead man's switch. Killing the leadership did not stop the machine. It simply confirmed that the machine no longer needed the leadership to keep running. Now look at the economics of this conflict, because the numbers are almost impossible to ignore. Iran has been using drones that cost somewhere between $35,000 and $50,000 to build. Some reports suggest Iran can produce around 500 of these drones every single day, with a stockpile that may run into the tens of thousands. On the other side, the United States has been using advanced missile defense systems to shoot these drones down. Each interceptor missile used in those systems costs around $1 million, and it often takes 2 or 3 of them to bring down a single drone. Do the math. That means it can cost $2 to $3 million to destroy a weapon that cost $50,000 to build. That is not a sustainable exchange rate in any war, no matter how rich the country defending itself is. And here is something that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage. While American officials have claimed air superiority and announced the destruction of Iran's navy, Much of what was actually destroyed appears to have been surface-level infrastructure and older vessels docked in ports, not Iran's real underground military capacity. Iran's ballistic missile stockpiles, its underground bunkers, and a large part of its nuclear infrastructure remain largely intact, hidden deep inside mountain ranges that make precision strikes extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Iran's strategy has been working on multiple fronts at once. Missile and drone attacks pushed American naval forces further away from the Iranian coastline. Strikes on American bases throughout the Gulf region caused damage so severe that some bases were described by American officials themselves as barely livable. Soldiers had to be relocated to hotels for safety, and even then, some of those hotels reportedly came under attack as well. Then there is a danger that almost nobody outside the region talks about. The Gulf states sitting across the water from Iran have almost no natural fresh water. The vast majority of their drinking water comes from desalination plants that turn seawater into something drinkable. These plants are massive, expensive, and almost impossible to defend against drone attacks. A $50,000 drone could potentially knock out infrastructure that millions of people depend on for survival. Iran sits behind a wall of mountains that protect its missile bases and drone facilities, while the entire Gulf coastline on the other side is flat, exposed desert with oil fields, ports, and water infrastructure that are extremely difficult to defend. And while all of this has been happening, Iran has continued to project strength rather than retreat. It unveiled a new high-speed naval vessel capable of reaching extremely high speeds and carrying long-range missile systems, presenting it publicly as a symbol of its growing maritime power. This was not the unveiling of a country on the verge of collapse. This was the unveiling of a country signaling that it intends to remain a dominant force in these waters regardless of how the negotiations end. So now we arrive at the heart of the matter. While the world is fighting over a war, Iran is fighting for something bigger: control of the rules. Reports of a draft agreement leaked through Iranian state media suggest that Iran is seeking the authority to determine what kind of vessels pass through the strait, to collect navigation fees, to require cargo information from ships, and to conduct inspections on any vessel it considers a potential threat. If something like this becomes the accepted framework going forward, it would not just affect this one conflict. It would create a long-term shift in who actually controls one of the most important trade routes on the planet. As one analyst put it, there will be no return to confident, predictable shipping through these waters. A temporary calm is not the same thing as real stability, and anyone hoping a peace deal will simply rewind the clock to how things were before this war started is likely to be disappointed. This is exactly what makes the Kindleberger Trap so dangerous. It does not announce itself with explosions and headlines the way a war does. It creeps in quietly through permits and fees and inspection rules until one day the world realizes that the open, predictable system everyone depended on for decades has quietly become something else entirely, controlled by whoever was strong enough and patient enough to take it. If you are starting to see how these small details connect into something much bigger, that is exactly the kind of thinking this channel is built around. Subscribe now so the next breakdown lands in your feed automatically, because this story is far from finished, and we are going to keep tracking it. Now let's turn to the country that started this war, because the contradictions happening inside the United States right now tell us just as much about the Kindleberger Trap as anything happening at sea. When this conflict began, the stated goals from Washington were enormous: complete regime change in Iran, total dismantling of its nuclear and missile programs, unconditional surrender. Those were the ambitions on day one. Now look at what is actually being negotiated: a temporary 60-day agreement, with disputes still raging over the exact wording on Iran's uranium stockpile and the conditions for reopening shipping through the strait. Even some of Trump's own political allies have criticized the emerging deal harshly, comparing it to the very nuclear agreement from the Obama years that Trump once called the worst deal in history. In other words, critics on his own side are accusing him of doing exactly what he once condemned someone else for doing. At the negotiating table, three major disputes remain unresolved. Iran wants billions of dollars in frozen assets released immediately. The United States wants any release tied to performance and gradual steps, not handed over all at once. Iran is also pushing for financial compensation for war damage, reportedly through a massive reconstruction fund. America has made no firm commitment to this, And Iran wants sanctions on its oil industry lifted while talks are still ongoing. Again, no commitment from Washington. These are not small technical disagreements. These are fundamental questions about money, sovereignty, and trust, and none of them have been resolved. Meanwhile, the fighting has not actually stopped. Iran's forces have continued shooting down American drones that enter its territorial waters. And each time, Iranian officials issue strong statements warning that further aggression will be met with serious consequences. This pattern has a name among observers. Big promises followed by shrinking outcomes, followed by threats that never quite turn into action, while the other side simply keeps doing what it was already doing. At the same time, on the enforcement side, the American military has carried out strikes against commercial ships that ignored repeated warnings while attempting to reach Iranian ports, disabling several vessels and redirecting more than 100 others. But at the very same time, there have been reports that American forces have quietly helped other commercial ships slip through the strait undetected by turning off their tracking systems, and that some tankers have been allowed to cross even after paying fees directly to Iran. On one hand, missiles are being fired to enforce a blockade. On the other hand, quiet workarounds are being used to get around that same blockade. That is not a coherent strategy. That is improvisation under pressure, the unmistakable sign of a power trying to project strength while privately accepting that it cannot fully control the situation. And the cost of all this is becoming impossible to hide. The financial toll of this war has already crossed many tens of billions of dollars, running at well over $1 billion a day, 3 times higher than initial official estimates. Additional funding requests running into the hundreds of billions have already been submitted. Soldiers have died. Hundreds more have been wounded. Damage to American bases in the region runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars, with some bases described as barely usable. An American airline has gone bankrupt due to skyrocketing fuel costs tied to the disruption in the Gulf. Fertilizer prices have spiked sharply because a key ingredient has become scarce and expensive. Jet fuel prices have surged as well. These numbers are not abstract. They show up in grocery bills, in airline tickets, in the cost of growing food, and ordinary people are noticing. Public opinion reflects this clearly. The majority of Americans oppose this war, and remarkably, even a majority of the president's own supporters say they oppose continued military involvement in this conflict. This opposition has fueled real public movements and protests across the country. Approval ratings for the administration have dropped into deeply uncomfortable territory. At one particularly tense moment, a public statement warning of catastrophic consequences if Iran did not concede sparked fears that nuclear conflict was being threatened, drawing sharp criticism from lawmakers across the political spectrum. Around the same time, footage circulated showing official war-related content that appeared to blend real combat footage with material resembling video games and films, triggering accusations that the war was being turned into entertainment. On top of that, threats were reportedly made against broadcasters airing critical coverage of the war, drawing immediate accusations of authoritarian overreach. This is the picture inside the country that is supposed to be the guarantor of global stability. A nation spending enormous amounts of money, losing lives, facing internal political fractures, and watching its own public turn against the war, all while still trying to project an image of total strength on the world stage. Now let's be fair, because a strong argument deserves to be heard honestly. Someone could reasonably say that America still has the most powerful military on the planet. Its navy is unmatched. Its economy is still the largest in the world. The fact that negotiations are happening at all could be seen as proof that pressure is working, that diplomacy combined with strength is producing results, and if a final deal is reached, it could be presented as a vindication of the strategy used throughout this conflict. This argument has real weight, and it should not be dismissed. But here is what it struggles to explain. Intelligence assessments suggest Iran's nuclear program may have only been delayed by a year or two, with much of its enriched material stored safely underground, untouched. Strategic deterrent resources meant for other parts of the world have been pulled into this conflict, delaying weapons deliveries elsewhere and straining military stockpiles. And on the diplomatic front, several traditional allies have refused to support this operation in meaningful ways, declining the use of their airspace and military bases. When you ask your closest partners for help protecting a critical waterway, and they decline, that is not a coalition acting from strength. That is one country acting largely alone while calling it a coalition. This is what the ancient warning from the Thucydides story was actually about in the first place. Not simply that powerful nations clash with each other, but that overconfidence destroys empires from within. A historical naval expedition far from home, launched against a well-prepared opponent driven by excessive confidence rather than necessity, ended up costing an entire empire its future. A modern power, stepping into a war against a country that spent decades preparing exactly for this kind of confrontation, is now facing a long, costly, draining standoff instead of a quick, clean victory, all while its alliances weaken and its own citizens turn against the effort. So here is the picture once all of these threads are pulled together. The conversation about a clash between two giant superpowers grabs headlines and feels dramatic, but so far it has not turned into open war, and that is genuinely good news. The real danger was never that obvious. The real danger is quieter, slower, and much harder to notice while it is happening. One global power steps back from its traditional role. Another rising power refuses to take on that responsibility. And into the empty space left behind steps a regional player, one with the geography, the patience, and the decades of preparation needed to seize control of something the entire world depends on. That is exactly what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now. Ships are crossing under permits issued by a regional power instead of any global authority. Fees are being collected by a single nation instead of by any international system. A draft framework is reportedly being prepared that would formalize this control, turning a temporary wartime workaround into a long-term structural reality. This is not simply a disruption that ends when the fighting stops. This is a fundamental shift in who actually holds power over a piece of the global commons. If a final deal is eventually signed, watch closely what happens next, because that will tell you more than any press conference. Watch the exact wording about Iran's nuclear material, because vague language with no enforceable timeline means the underlying problem never actually went away. Watch whether shipping companies and insurance providers continue pricing in Iranian control over these waters even after a ceasefire is announced, because those companies operate purely on risk calculations, not political statements, and their behavior reveals the truth more honestly than any official statement ever could. And watch the political fallout inside the United States, because billions spent, lives lost, allies alienated, and a divided public do not simply disappear the moment a deal is signed. That cost has already been paid, regardless of how this conflict officially ends. Before we close this out, if this video helped you see the bigger picture behind this story, do something simple. Share it with someone who only sees the surface-level headlines, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets misunderstood when people only watch the daily news cycle instead of the deeper pattern underneath it. So here's the real question, the one that matters far more than who wins or loses this particular war. What happens to a world where global trade routes, energy supplies, and critical infrastructure are no longer protected by agreed-upon international rules, but instead are controlled by whichever regional power happens to be strong enough, patient enough, and prepared enough to take charge in any given moment? What does that world look like for smaller nations who cannot set their own terms? What does it look like for the millions of people whose daily lives depend on seas, ports, and waterways that no global authority is actively protecting anymore? What does it look like for the next generation who will inherit whatever version of this world we are currently building, one decision at a time, in Washington, in Tehran, in Beijing, and everywhere in between? Nobody truly knows the final answer yet, and anyone who claims they do is not being completely honest with you. But one thing is becoming impossible to ignore. The world is not falling apart because two giant powers are fighting each other. It is quietly fragmenting because the powers capable of holding it together have chosen again and again not to. And in that silence, in that absence of leadership, someone else is always willing to step in and take control. The only real question left is whether the rest of the world is prepared for what that means.